All right, let's dive into one of those questions that just never goes away, the problem of evil. How can a loving, all-powerful God exist when there's so much suffering in the world?
Yeah, it's a question that has haunted humanity for as long as we've been around.
And today, we're going to look at how Dostoevsky tackles this in The Brothers Karamazov.
Oh, Dostoevsky, he doesn't pull any punches.
No, he does not. He really forces us to confront that raw, emotional and spiritual crisis that suffering can trigger.
Right,
Really.
absolutely. He takes us way beyond just the theoretical argument.
Because there is that theoretical side.
Right, trying to reconcile God's goodness with all the bad stuff that happens.
Yeah, the logic puzzle of it all. But Dostoevsky, he's more interested in the existential side.
He throws us right into the emotional turmoil, the doubt, the anger, the feeling of abandonment.
And he does it through some really powerful characters.
Oh, yeah. Like Ivan Karamazov, the atheist brother who just can't accept any kind of divine plan when he looks at the suffering of innocence.
Especially children.
Right, that's key for Ivan. He's not interested in theological loopholes. He's fixated on the actual pain, the reality of it.
And that famous line of his, "I don't want a part of that."
Powerful stuff. He's rejecting any supposed harmony that's built on that kind of suffering.
It's like he's saying, even if there's a bigger picture, even if it all makes sense somehow in the end, the cost is just too high.
And Dostoevsky doesn't give us any easy answers through Ivan.
No, he just lets us sit with that discomfort.
He wants us to wrestle with it, just like Ivan does.
But then we have Father Zosima. He represents a completely different response to suffering.
Right. This wise, saintly monk. People are drawn to him,
Yeah, he has this aura about him, but here's the thing.
He's not blind to suffering.
No, he's not. He fully acknowledges it. He's experienced it himself, and yet his faith remains totally unshaken.
It's remarkable.
So is he just suppressing the doubt, ignoring the reality of the pain?
Not at all. What's fascinating is that he doesn't try to argue Ivan down. He doesn't offer some logical counter-argument.
So he's not playing that intellectual game.
Nope. He embodies a different possibility altogether. He shows us that deep faith and a profound awareness of suffering, they can actually coexist.
So rather than giving us some neat explanation, Zosima's very existence is kind of the answer. It's like Dostoevsky saying, look, this kind of faith is possible, even in a world full of pain.
Yeah, it's a different way of approaching the problem altogether.
And it's here that our source material brings in a really interesting perspective. Theodosius Dobzhansky. Brilliant scientist.
Right, one of the founders of the modern evolutionary synthesis.
But also a devout Orthodox Christian. So we've got this incredible blend of science and spirituality.
Yeah, a powerful combination. And Dobzhansky doesn't dismiss Zosima as some naive idealist. He sees him as someone who's achieved a certain level of spiritual development, a level where faith and this deep awareness of suffering, they can not only coexist, but actually strengthen each other.
So he's saying this level of faith isn't just wishful thinking. It's an actual phenomenon.
Something that even a scientific mind can recognize.
Wow. But Dobzhansky also acknowledges that, reaching this level, it's not possible for everyone, especially for those who've experienced extreme trauma.
Right. He's not suggesting that people should just get over their suffering.
So where does that leave us? Even a devout scientist like Dobzhansky recognizes the limits of faith when faced with extreme suffering. What other perspectives are there?
Well, the source material goes on to explore this really interesting idea from theologian Marilyn McCord Adams. She suggests that those who suffer can find a kind of meaning, a way to transcend the pain by connecting it to the sacrifice of Christ.
Okay, I'm intrigued. This sounds like it could be really profound or really problematic.
It's definitely a challenging concept. But instead of dismissing it outright, let's unpack it a bit. She's not saying suffering is good or part of some divine plan we just can't understand.
Right. Not a God works in mysterious ways kind of argument.
No. She's talking about a mystical connection, a way to kind of tap into a source of strength and redemption that might not be accessible through logic alone.
So we're not talking about minimizing suffering or rationalizing it away. We're talking about finding a deeper meaning within it.
Exactly. Now, this does require us to accept the possibility of supernatural intervention. But as Christians, that's already kind of baked into our worldview.
It's almost like saying, look, if we believe in miracles, why can't we believe in this kind of spiritual transformation through suffering?
It does push us to think differently about the relationship between our pain and our faith.
So are we saying that the answer to the problem of evil is just accepting suffering?
Not quite. Remember Ivan. His moral outrage is important. It's not about passive acceptance, but about finding a way to hold this tension between suffering and faith.
So we're left with this tension between logic and faith. Our minds may never fully grasp the reasons for suffering, but perhaps through examples like Father Zosima and concepts like McCord Adams proposes, we can find a way for our hearts to keep believing.
And that's where we'll pick up next time. We'll explore more about how this tension plays out and what it might mean for each of us as we wrestle with this problem of evil.
It's a conversation that definitely goes beyond easy answers, and we're just getting started. Welcome back to our deep dive into the problem of evil. You know, that age-old question of how a loving God can exist alongside so much suffering.
Yeah, it's a question that can really shake us to our core.
And in part one, we saw how Dostoevsky, he doesn't shy away from the rawness of that question in The Brothers Karamazov. He presents us with these starkly different responses, like Ivan's rage and Father Zosima's unwavering faith.
It's interesting, how people often try to offer these simple platitudes when someone is grappling with this question.
Oh, I know, like everything happens for a reason.
Right, or God has a plan.
It's like they're trying to explain away the pain.
Instead of just acknowledging the reality of it.
Yeah, and that can be so dismissive.
Totally. And it's one of the things I appreciate so much about Dostoevsky.
Yeah.
He doesn't try to sugarcoat it or offer some magical answer.
He lets us see the raw struggle.
Through these incredibly complex characters.
Like Ivan and Father Zosima. And it seems like we're often told to choose between faith and reason.
You mean like pick a side?
Yeah, like we have to either believe in God despite the suffering.
Or reject the idea of a benevolent God altogether.
Exactly. But what if the real answer lies somewhere in between those extremes?
That's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
What if it's not about choosing sides, but about holding those two things in tension?
The intellectual and the emotional. The doubt and the belief.
Yeah, exactly. It's not easy, though.
No, not at all. But think about Father Zosima. He doesn't offer some logical proof for God's existence in the face of suffering. His answer, or maybe response is a better word, it's rooted in something much deeper.
He embodies a lived experience of faith.
Where compassion and this unwavering trust in God can coexist.
But isn't that kind of faith, unattainable for most people?
Yeah, I mean, especially those who haven't had as unique life experiences.
Right, and that's where Dobzhansky's perspective is so valuable.
Right, the scientist.
Yes. With his scientific background, he didn't see Zosima's faith as just some kind of sentimentality or blind belief.
So we're not talking about purely emotional.
No. He saw it as a legitimate way of knowing, a kind of evidence that can't be measured in a lab, but is nonetheless real.
Wow. So he's saying we need to open ourselves up to different ways of understanding the world.
Especially when dealing with something as profound and mysterious as the problem of evil. And, we also talked about Marilyn McCord Adams.
Yes, and her idea of connecting our suffering to the sacrifice of Christ.
You mentioned it was challenging.
I'm curious to hear more about why that is.
Well, it asks us to look beyond the immediate pain.
Okay.
And consider the possibility of a deeper meaning.
A redemptive element within the suffering itself.
And I know that can be really hard to grasp.
Yeah, especially when you're in the midst of it.
Absolutely. But it's not about romanticizing suffering or saying it's somehow good or necessary.
It's definitely not a suffering is good for you kind of argument.
No, not at all. It's about finding a way to transcend the pain.
Okay.
By connecting it to something larger than ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think this idea speaks to a very human need. A need to find meaning in our experiences, even the most painful ones.
So it's not about denial or suppression of suffering. It's about understanding it in a different context.
Exactly. If we can find meaning in our suffering, if we can see it as connected to something greater, then perhaps it can become a source of strength.
Instead of just despair.
Right. And it might even help us connect more deeply with God.
I see why this is such a challenging concept. It asks us to shift our perspective on something that just feels so inherently negative and look for the possibility of something positive within it.
It's a real leap of faith. But this idea of connecting to Christ's sacrifice, it also raises some interesting questions about the nature of God himself.
Whoa. How so?
Well, if God is all-powerful and all-loving, why did he choose this path? Why allow his own son to suffer so terribly?
That's a question that has troubled theologians for centuries.
And there are no easy answers. But one possibility is that in his infinite love, God chose to experience the full depth of human suffering alongside us.
So instead of remaining distant and detached,
He chose to share in our pain.
so rather than seeing God as this aloof observer, we can imagine him as a fellow sufferer.
Walking alongside us through our darkest moments.
That's a pretty radical idea.
It is.
Yeah.
And it suggests that God's love is not just some passive feeling or abstract concept.
It's an active choice to be present with us in our pain.
To experience it alongside us.
That really changes how we typically think about God's relationship to suffering.
It suggests that maybe God isn't simply allowing it to happen, but choosing to participate in it, out of love.
And in that shared experience of suffering, maybe we can find a glimmer of hope.
A sense of solidarity that transcends the pain and isolation.
But how do we reconcile this idea with the sheer magnitude of suffering in the world? Is this solidarity even possible when faced with such overwhelming pain?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at what the shared experience of suffering might mean for us today and how it might help us find a path forward in a world that often feels so full of darkness.
Welcome back. We've been on quite a journey exploring the problem of evil. How can a loving God exist alongside so much suffering?
Yeah, it's a question that can really shake us to our core, can't it?
Absolutely. We've explored the emotional turmoil of doubt, like Ivan's anger in the brothers Karamazov.
Right, that raw, visceral reaction to suffering.
And we've contrasted that with Father Zosima's, almost unshakable faith.
His unwavering trust in God, despite being fully aware of the suffering in the world.
And we even saw how a scientist, a leading mind like Dobzhansky, recognized the validity of that kind of lived faith.
He saw it as a real phenomenon, a legitimate way of knowing.
Then we started unpacking that really challenging idea from Marilyn McCord Adams about finding meaning by connecting our suffering to the sacrifice of Christ.
Right, a concept that definitely pushes us beyond simple answers.
So where do we go from here? What does all of this mean for someone listening right now? Someone who might be wrestling with their own pain, their own questions about God in the face of suffering?
Well, I think it's essential to start by acknowledging the validity of those feelings.
Mm-hmm.
The anger, the confusion, the despair, all of it. Those are all legitimate responses to the reality of suffering.
It's so important to honor those feelings, not try to shove them down or pretend they don't exist.
Exactly. Don't let anyone tell you to just look on the bright side or have more faith.
Yeah, those platitudes, they minimize the pain.
They're dismissive and hurtful. So acknowledge the pain. But then consider this. Just as Ivan's perspective is valid, so is Zosima's. Just as doubt is a legitimate response to suffering, so is faith. It's not about choosing one over the other.
Right, it's not an either situation.
It's about holding those seemingly contradictory experiences in tension.
Embracing the complexity. But what about finding a way forward? Is there any practical advice you could offer to someone who's feeling lost, maybe even abandoned by God in the midst of their suffering?
Well, this is where the idea of witness becomes so powerful. If you're struggling to find your own way through the darkness, seek out those who have walked a similar path.
You mean look for real-life examples of people like Father Zosima?
Yes. People whose faith has been tested but not broken. People who have found a way to hold on to their belief in a loving God despite experiencing profound suffering.
Their stories can be so inspiring, can't they?
They offer a glimmer of hope, a sense that it is possible to find meaning and purpose even in the midst of pain. And, their experiences might not erase your own pain, but they can remind you that you're not alone in this struggle.
It's almost like finding a guide, someone who's been through the wilderness before and can offer some insights on navigating the terrain.
Exactly. And finally, I would encourage you to explore the idea of connecting your own suffering to the suffering of Christ. Now, I know this might not resonate with everyone, and that's perfectly okay.
We've talked about how it's not about glorifying suffering or pretending it's a good thing.
Right. But if you're open to it, consider the possibility that your pain, however unjust or senseless it may seem, can become a source of deeper connection with the divine.
A way to find a kind of spiritual transformation through suffering.
Something that logic and reason alone can't fully grasp.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the problem of evil, it seems like we're left with more questions than answers.
Maybe that's okay.
Yeah, perhaps the most important takeaway is that this is a journey, not a destination.
There will be times of doubt, times of anger, times of despair, but there will also be moments of grace, moments of connection, moments of profound peace. Don't be afraid to embrace the full spectrum of the experience.
And don't give up on the search for meaning. Even in the darkest of times, there's always hope.
Always.
Thanks for joining us.